Thanks, Kate, for inviting me. I'm sorry that I missed the other speakers because all the projects sounded really, really interesting, but I'm glad to be here and see the cafe up and running. Kate had asked me to provide some grounded theory, by which I presumed she meant theory that's not abstract, but connected to and emerging out of actual events and practices, to provide some grounded theory, I think, for helping to think about maybe what she's trying to do at the Feral Trade Cafe. So I'm not sure how helpful I will be, but I'll give it a try. And actually, what I want to start is to work off from the project I did with Natasha that Kate just mentioned. That's how she found me, and I think she saw that, yeah, the efflux piece in which Natasha and I published a revised version of the interview and some of the video from that project. So I'll start there, that the project with Natasha was about food and politics, and then I'll try to move to questions around commoning and piracy and running away. This is my title, commoning, piracy, and running away, and other incidents in the life of living otherwise. Okay. What Natasha really wanted to do was to try to understand what it meant that Whole Foods was appropriating, basically for commercial profitability, a set of radical ecological and political ideas, and how these kinds of contradictions would impact political agency, especially political agency of a kind of everyday kind. I was a little bit less interested in the contradictions of consumer culture. I'm going to say why in a second, but in part because these are contradictions I think that many of us have become very familiar, perhaps too comfortable even with. But more interested, and this is what my work has been about, radical movements and practices. That is to say, when, where, how people oppose and defy, in this case, capitalist norms, and also try to live differently otherwise than by the given terms of order. The Whole Foods, and I think it's possible to use Whole Foods as a kind of shorthand for the industrial, organic, supermarket, mega chain sector, just to wind it all up like that, essentially coexists alongside movements, activities, everyday life practices that are, of course, far more radical than it, that are oriented not towards reproducing capitalist economic and ideational or ideological relations, but are oriented towards creating alternative ones. I think this is a very important point. Industrial, organic, or commercially organized fair trade, this is obviously a particular concern for Kate and her project, so Starbucks would be an example of that. They are growing notably, I think, but at the same time, so is local sustainable scale food production, distribution, and consumption. So your local supermarket will now put, hundreds of expensive organic food products in oil-based plastic containers that require unsustainable levels of energy to poorly recycle. So that's, on the one hand, what's happening. But at the very same time, we have been now for quite some time seeing really explosive battles over seeds, over genetic modification of food, over the politics of waste and garbage, struggles that are, I think, particularly important for highlighting the differential impacts of environmental racism, which is an important issue. So these critical movements and activities, they exist alongside the industrial and the commercial. And even though, some of these oppositional and alternative activities are closer or further away from the mainstream, I think it's fair to say that the industrial organic supermarket or the commercially based fair trade system would not exist without the oppositional movements that essentially have prompted them into existence. So they have a certain kind of relationship to each other. Starbucks is, I think, actually a really good example. It was the boycott of Starbucks and its symbolic status during the protests against the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999 that led the company to wager, successfully actually, that its rather monopolistic designs would be enhanced if it went organic and if it could become a leader in controlling the regulatory process that certifies fair trade goods. And it has, in fact, that wager, as we say, was very smart, very successful. They're a major player in that regulatory process. Starbucks is not a social movement. It's not a critical, defiant social movement. It's a global corporation that whatever quality it genuinely hopes its products will offer, nonetheless seeks to, extend its monopoly over the coffee market and to increase its products. I don't think people confuse Starbucks with the kind of critical movements and activities that I'm talking about, because what's sort of characteristic of these movements is that they're trying to create and practice alternative ways of living and eating and cleaning up after ourselves, alternative even to the best responsible corporation like Starbucks, which is a very responsible corporation in many ways. But these movements they're grounded in new ways of doing science, new ways of producing knowledge. They also, I think, model in interesting ways new political formations and forms of self-governance. So you can see the organic mega supermarket or the sort of transnational fair trade giant and the, for example, radical Indian seed farmers like Nabdanya as contradictions, and they are obviously to some extent, but I think that we could perhaps see them more clearly really as negations of most of what Whole Foods or Starbucks is or represents. So now as negations, they're something else, defined only in part by their refusal of Whole Foods or Starbucks, defined in other parts by what they positively desire and stand for. They're, in a way, I think, more helpful to think of them as parts of a kind of parallel universe of living otherwise that exists on proximate, close, but differential planes. So, of course, corporate model is far more dominant and institutionally powerful than all its radical alternatives, but that just highlights how important it is to figure out how to shift the balance from the one to the other. That then becomes, I think, the political tasks. If we start with these parallel political universes with the sort of social struggles and the more quiet, fugitive activities that negate the Whole Foods in that sense, then I think it's possible to find not only the historical precedents or other kind of far-flung examples that can then connect us to the past, to the future, and that situate our own activities, if you're involved in this kind of thing, within a continuum or a tradition, however broken, fragmented, contentious, or even invented that tradition is. A tradition, I think, is important because it's an archive of knowledge to draw on and share, and because it reminds us of the reality of living otherwise, its actual existence, as opposed to the thing that is always impossible and going to happen like in some other future that we're never going to get to. Okay, so the tradition tells you it happened before, it's happening now, it'll happen in the future. That's very important for any kind of political movement. One of the things that for me, I think, or the thing for me that was most striking about being in the Whole Foods was what was really unspoken or invisible in all the advertisements and solicitations and self-promotions that Whole Foods produces in the store and outside of it. It's sort of famous for the way it talks about itself and what it's doing. And that was, you're in the store, you're there, you're reading all its information circulating around, and what's exactly missing is, of course, the more radical critique of exactly those companies and individuals whose aim is, in effect, to privatize and to sell the common means of life, including food and water. And so what seems, in effect, when you're there to kind of haunt the Whole Foods, this is true of other places like it, were the faces, the history, the voices of groups like Earth First, for example, which in the United States is considered a terrorist organization by the US government. You all might be aware, of course, that the UK government is now branded certain people it calls environmental extremists as terrorists. This is now happening here as well. So you don't see, Earth First is absent in the Whole Foods. Nothing like that is even there. Or in the case that interested me there, the diggers. And so the thing that I actually did in that project, and my little contribution to it, was to try to bring the voices of the diggers back to the Whole Foods, which I did by sort of talking about them there and reading one of their most famous manifestos that was written by Gerald Winstanley, signed by about 20 of the 200 people who occupied St. George's Hill in Surrey, and that was entitled, as these 17th century tracts were wont to do. It has a really long title. The title is A Declaration from the Poor Oppressed People of England, directed to all that call themselves or are called Lords of Manors, that have begun to cut forth that through fear and covetousness do intend to cut down the woods and trees that grow upon the commons and the wasteland. This is just the title of the manifesto. Okay, but it says pretty much a lot in the title. I'm not going to read you the manifesto again today. Do people here sort of remember or know who the diggers were? Did you learn about them in school? Yeah. Okay. So. No, okay, the diggers, or the true levelers, as they called themselves the true levelers, were anarchistic, communistic, radically self-governing commoners who appeared among a series of radical groups, including the original levelers and the ranters during the English Civil War, particularly between the 1630s and 1650s. And they were part of what the historian Christopher Hill called the Second English Revolution, a revolution, he said, which never happened, but which threatened to succeed from time to time. So now this revolution that never happened, but which threatened to succeed from time to time, might have established communal rather than private property and a broader political democracy, or democracy in political and legal institutions, might have disestablished the state church and rejected the Protestant ethic. The diggers were part of this second revolution, part of what you might think of as a fork opened in the historical road, which in the main has been erased from an official history, of course, that celebrates the benefits of capitalist parliamentary democracy over monarchical absolutism, which is normally how the story is told. The diggers were called the diggers because they not only believed in the equality of persons and the leveling of inequalities and indignities between rich and poor and between the powerful and the powerless, but because they also formed cooperative communities to prevent the enclosure of common land and the further privatization of property in England where they were. And they would literally squat, occupy, and dig up common land. They would create growing fields out of the commons and wastelands. They would give away the things that they grew, the produce and stuff that they grew on the land, and they would invite others to come and join them. So as you can well imagine, they were attacked by the police, the state, the local landowners, and eventually their movement was destroyed. But the ideas that guided them never really disappeared. The diggers are very interesting. In 1649, the diggers were already denouncing very clearly concentrated power, private property, and the capitalist money economy, which was not even yet dominant. It was in the process of becoming so, but was not yet dominant. They saw very clearly that so-called free markets or free capitalist economies were established only with violence and war, and that the representative democracy that was being promised them gave to the state the power to police the poor and the landless as criminals, and the right, of course, by the state to hold a monopoly over the use of force. This was a major issue having to do with the New Model Army, so we don't need to get into that. What I think is important today about the Diggers is that in many ways, one of the things that you can see in the written manifestos, the activities that they were involved in is almost like the kind of analytic core of what's become central to the reemergence of the commons as a social goal and a kind of political watchword for a kind of radical environmentalism that links a critique of private property, consumerism, and money worship on the one hand, to self-organized democratic governance without war, without policing, and without the tyrannical state. This is a much more radical kind of environmentalism than, please don't forget to recycle your plastic container. Okay, we're in a totally different world here, right? So for me, the Diggers brings us to the commons and its reemergence today. And for me, and I'm saying for me because I think that there are other ways that people are thinking about this, but so for me, and part of the legacy that I take from the Diggers and those that sort of follow in their tradition of thinking is that the whole question of the commons is about precisely this question of alternative ways of living. It's not, that's to say, it's not only about types of property ownership. It's not only about land ownership or intellectual property. I think when most people think about the commons, they think about open source and intellectual property. I think that's kind of the tag. Not just about property ownership or forms of economic production like cooperatives. It's not, I think, about promoting a rural way of life at the expense of urban sub or ex-urban forms of life, or promoting a kind of nostalgia for good old days that never existed. I think that this very large question of the commons is about how to live autonomously and together, given the persistence of old and the creation of new enclosures. And as I'm going to suggest in just a minute, commons and enclosure go together. Okay, these two go together. The enclosure and the commons tend to go together. What's distinctive, I think, about the evocation of the commons as a political watchword is that it sort of directs our attention to the everyday life of property relations, to how, what, where, to the how, what, where, who of food, water, wood, knowledge, work, play, trash, and so on. So we're not just thinking about property relations as merely a matter of finance or legal matters of ownership, but we're really thinking about how it operates at the level of everyday life, and asks us, I think, to begin to think anew about modalities of exchange and sociality. So taking, giving, sharing, directing, ordering, supplying, transporting, building, etc., in a context in which their dominant organization is unsustainable and unlivable for way too many, and in a context, the same context, I think, in which many of us are already doing these things better and more equitably, even if without enough support. This is the main point. If I say anything, you actually hear that we are already doing many of these things. They are not to come in some unknown future, but they are already things that are being done, and the question is how to make them dominant as opposed to pretend like they don't exist or imagine we have to keep inventing them quite anew. This question of how to cultivate alternative ways of living and being is like a huge question, very immodest, you could say. Certainly, I think very difficult to grasp at too high a level of generality, So first, in a way, you have to have a little bit of a sense of humor in asking seriously, how should we live? What is the meaning of life? Or at least so you're supposed to laugh now, have a little smile, like, yes, okay, have a little sense of humor. Or at least to have some self-awareness, this is maybe the more serious point, of the absurdity in asking how to live, which most of us really do know how to do, but we continue to act as if we do not. And also a certain absurdity in having to answer this question over and over and over again, and having to reestablish equity, justice, dignity, sharing, these principles over and over and over again. This condition, I think, of knowing what life is for in this sense, but having to act like one does not know, of having to ask the questions again and again, can be very frustrating. And it also can lead to the questions and the answers becoming more and more abstract, a kind of condensation that covers up maybe a certain embarrassment or boredom with the repetition. I think it's important to be careful about this, careful to be in one's thinking and one's interactions with others and one's political life, patient with the questions because they repeat, not I think because we're stupid, but because we still need to answer them repetitively over and over again. The writer John Berger famously said that there are always more terrors to surprise us, but rarely new happinesses, that they are always the same old ones that we are forever trying to achieve. And this makes us think we don't know what they are. So what does that mean? How to cultivate alternative ways of life? The questions, I think, very easy to say, but difficult to answer. The first one, I would put it this way: how do we and how have we for so long lived in societies in which the terms for living are so narrow, so enclosed, and produce so much misery and division between those who have and those who have not? I like the way that Massimo De Angelis puts it. He says, the question is not what we are against, but what we are up against. That's what he puts it. Second question, how can we live differently, better, with greater happiness and less deathly division between ourselves and within ourselves? And for me, absolutely a crucial part of this question is, how do we already live better than we presume is required, and that those dominant terms of order impose as normal and inevitable? This man, De Angelis, is the editor of a journal called The Commoner, and he says this, I'm quoting him now. In the beginning, there is the doing, the social flow, this is the theory part, okay. In the beginning, there is the doing, the social flow of human interaction and creativity, and the doing is imprisoned by the deed, and the deed wants to dominate the doing and life, and the doing is turned into work and people into things. Thus, the world is crazy, and revolts are also practices of hope. We live in a world in which the separation of doing and deed is extended in an increasing number of spheres of life, and also in which the revolt about this separation is ubiquitous. That's De Angelis. Now, I think to know that capitalism is dominant or to know how it works isn't necessarily to know that it's crazy in the way that he means that. This is a second, maybe even a first step. Doing is separated from deeds, and also, of course, from thoughts and ideas and beliefs, and what we take to be often our most cherished senses of self and cherished values. It's in this sense that I think grounded theory, Kate, is important that you ask for, because philosophy and theory can ask questions about living. That's traditionally one of the things that philosophy does. But in order to answer them, it has to actually get to living, not only in its social organization or institutional formats, but to how each of us does it day by day, wherever we are. That is to say, always living in practice, working out the alternative in the doing it, forging it sort of in the crucible, you could say, of its sustainability and reality. For me, this is a fundamental assumption and the work, writing, teaching, activist work that I've done, for me, has been taken up with trying to find this radical thought in practice, sometimes thought with a capital T, sometimes thought with a small t, to try to understand its lessons and to promote its extension. Always working out the alternative in practice in the crucible of its sustainability and its reality. Sometimes it's called immanent politics. It's also, I think, a modality of living and not just working. And so in that sense, crucial to the establishment of a way of life that is not dominated by the value of hard labor. This is a whole other topic we could talk about another time. That's the lingering kind of productivist ethos, or the Protestant ethic, as the Diggers would have had it, that still dominates anti-capitalist struggles and others connected to it, despite very good critiques of it. One of my favorites was entitled The Right to be Lazy. It was written by Karl Marx's brother-in-law, Paul Lafargue, in 1883 while he was in prison. It's really great. It's very tiny. It's about 25, 30 pages. It's called The Right to be Lazy. It's very good. Okay, so I think that's the grounded theory. Okay, the commons, something like that. The commons is not a new idea then, obviously, but the way we understand it today and the way it's being used today in that political watchword sense really emerged about 20 years ago when it appeared in the early struggles against neoliberalism. And it was, I think, probably most dramatically resurrected by Marcos and the Zapatistas, because the emergence of their struggle in the early 1980s was directly related to the expropriation of indigenous communities' resources, not just land, also oil, especially electricity, to some extent labor. And because as an organizational struggle, the IZL, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, remains still communal and based on indigenous governance assemblies, although it's an interesting hybrid. Perhaps I will skip, not give you so much background on this, just to say that it was a very important struggle there. And one of the things that, one of the reasons, I mean, partially the nature of the struggle itself was important. Partially it was that in 1992, the Zapatistas, who were at the time relatively unknown outside of Mexico, famously declared war from the Lacandon jungle. And they issued this was the beginning of some of these communiques that Marcos started issuing. There was a famous one called The Southeast in Two Winds. And in that, he really used the terminology of enclosure and commons and kind of resurrected that terminology. And partially that piece and the example of the Zapatistas were especially influential and inspiring to a group of, some of them were theorists, scholar, activists, associated with two important journals, one The Commoner, so Angeles was read it, and the other was called Midnight Notes. They were also, the Zapatistas, an inspiration to, partially I say this too because we think that some of these struggles against globalization and neoliberalism began much later than they actually did. So just to situate that, even in the present moment, a little bit earlier. They were also, I think, an inspiration to some of the people most associated today with the theoretical rethinking and rewriting of the commons. So some of these people you'll probably have heard of: Peter Lindau, the Magna Carta Manifesto, Sylvia Federici and her great book Caliban and the Witch, John Holloway, Michael Hart. The new work with Negri is called Commonwealth. Michael had been involved in Central American struggles in the 1980s. So when the Midnight Notes Collective published a special issue in 1990 on what they called the new enclosures, this really opened up an important framework for understanding what was happening in this particular phase of capitalist expansion, what they rightly called a new wave of primitive accumulation. And it also began to suggest commons and commoning as an alternative to either privatization and private property, the neoliberal model, the structural adjustment model, and nationalization, which was the form of socialization common to obviously the post-World War II communist second world, and also to some extent the social democratic first. I mean, ironically, today it's actually in places like Oaxaca and large parts of indigenous Guatemala where the fair trade battles, especially around coffee and chocolate, are most taking place. There's an interesting return to that site. But the description or the attempt to describe this what's often goes by the name of globalization or neoliberalism in terms of enclosure was very important, because for most people the term enclosure was a technical one in many ways, used in the 16th century to describe the elimination of communal property. And in fact, it had initially a very specific meaning, referring to the abolition of the open field system and the literal fencing off of the commons. The first wave of these enclosures took place in the late 1400s as a response to sort of crisis, really, in feudal authority from below. Big wave of peasant uprisings across Europe, vast heresy movement beginning in the 12th, 13th centuries and across, and also to some extent a crisis of authority from above, a period of time not that dissimilar to our own. And so, as you know, of course, the enclosures did not end, they continued. And one of the things that became very clear was that enclosure was not just sort of a technical operation, a fencing off, a transfer of legal right and property, but it was a means of accumulation whose outcome was wealth acquisition on the one hand and dispossession on the other. The appropriation of public, also common lands, the commercialization of agriculture, the establishment of an export-based and imperial economy had, of course, tremendous social consequences. The destructive transformation of village life, the whole clearance of the whole Scottish Highlands, for example, is probably very familiar to people here. And in general, the creation of a large, mobile, poor population turned essentially into vagabonds and beggars. So those people who were not shipped off to the Caribbean, the United States as indentured servants, were turned then, of course, into wage laborers, free now from the fetters of traditional life to enter modern industrial life. So when Midnight Notes called the regime or phase of capitalist expansion that began in the mid-1970s the new enclosures, and sort of called out the figures of this reorganization, interestingly, in their old names. This is what they called them: paupers, vagabonds, criminals, panhandlers, mercenaries, rioters, and so on. The historical resonance was particularly important politically and also theoretically, because the predominant understanding, particularly among Marxist historians and theorists at the time, was that the enclosures had been a very crucial stage in the creation of industrial capitalism. It was an important mechanism by which a population of people that were newly displaced, desperate, to some extent disgraced as well, became available to be accumulated as labor power. And Marx called this original, or what he called primitive accumulation, this what he saw as a necessary condition for the development of capitalism. He called it primitive accumulation. But he was wrong in two ways that the new enclosures made clear. So first, he was wrong about the significance of the English enclosures. They were extraordinarily destructive for English peasants and for and of traditional rural life, but they were not sufficient actually for the development of industrial capitalism, which was never merely a national political economy. Capitalist expansion was impossible without what was at the time the greatest land grab that anyone had ever known, and that was the African slave trade and the colonization of the Americas. This was, of course, a rather multinational effort. Okay, so this you can see the resonance now to what all of a sudden people are thinking is new in this second wave. It's maybe not so new. On the one hand, he was wrong in not understanding the importance of the slave trade and various forms of colonialism to the expansion and the production of capitalism as we understand that. He was also wrong about something else, which was that to think that once this originary accumulation process was complete, that it would not repeat. So primitive accumulation repeats and turns out to be a permanent feature of capitalist expansion. It's not a one-term process. And so this framework of the new enclosures and the resurrection of the term primitive accumulation meant that the whole idea of what was necessary, the violence necessary to the development of capitalist expansion, was broadened. And so the primitive came to refer not only to the sort of savagery at the heart of capitalism, that thing that the diggers saw, that it couldn't happen without war and violence, but that also what was important was the division of the world into primitive, civilized, developed, underdeveloped. That was so important to imperialism and the various forms of neocolonialism that followed it. So that the examples that already were clear in 1990, structural produced land loss in Africa, courtesy of the World Bank, homelessness in the United States in response to debt defaults, massive displacement and migration in China as the free market spread, or the general sort of patterns that were already identifiable then, eliminating public or communal control over the means of subsistence, taking or seizing, mortgaging land for debt, intensifying various forms of insecurity or precariousness and therefore the mobility of labor, the collapsing of a whole series of compromise systems, social democracy being the main one, the sort of degraded mutation of human beings and human habitats. These things, which were already clear by the early 1990s, have multiplied, of course, and extended dramatically since then. And so one of the things that it became clear was that various kinds of social, spatial enclosures have been used to establish control over territories and people for a long time. And that these enclosures are maintained not just by physical boundaries, those original fences, but also by force, by armies and police, and by all kinds of other social, economic, and political traps, what a man named Clyde Wood calls trap economics. And in fact, one of the terms that people are using now, which I think is an interesting one for trying to talk about the extension of the enclosures, is asset stripping. To describe these kinds of mechanisms. And I think this term at least describes well the kind of waste and disruption and dispossession that's basically produced and accumulated in this process. And when we start to add this up across the world, and in Clyde Wood's case, who's studying this asset stripping in New Orleans, you can see it very, very, very clearly. But whether it's in New Orleans or Africa or other parts of the world, whether it's happening in first world, third world, it's a rather distressing picture of abandonment of public responsibilities, of the public trust, and of people. And I think that one of the example, whether I say it's like New Orleans or any of these others, or the diggers even several hundred years ago, show is that we begin to see really clearly that enclosure is not just about land or water or even labor in a simple sense, but about the broader array of resources and capacities that are being taken, contained, fenced in, sort of transformed to uses that are counter to humane purposes. So it may start with land, or real estate as it's called today, but it doesn't end there, and it's not restricted to property in a narrowly defined sense. So that the renewed call to the commons has basically been a kind of response, really, to this extensive and extreme forms of deprivation and privation. There's an enormous range of activities and types of thinking here that go under this, that are under this watchword of the commons. Everything from people running alternative non-money economic systems, whether they're bartering ones or angel economics, for those of you who know about that. Whole bunch of open source access initiatives, transnational water commons movement, producer cooperatives, whether in food or other things, including extending out to a steady set of confrontations, some armed, around all kinds of modes of living, rights and access to modes of living, that I think in retrospect historians are going to tell as a major people's work. I think that when the new historians that were able to go back and see, there wasn't this smooth development that we learned in school. First there were the Romans, and then there were the feudals, and then there were the moderns. It didn't work that way. I mean, there were all these forks and conjunctures and crises, and nothing happened in a pretty straight way, and there were huge struggles, especially from below. Here I think we're going to see a similar capacity, if we aren't all destroyed, be able to look back and do it. That's a real possibility, I'm afraid. And one of the things that is, just say a word about these, so I'm just looking at the time. Yeah, so let me just say a word about these social struggles that have been and are emerging in relationship to the new enclosures and to neoliberalism. Just three very quickly ways in which they were very distinctive. They are distinctive. And that's very true today, and then I just end up. The first feature of them is that knowledge from below is getting more and more savvy and sophisticated. This is a real characteristic of these movements. Not only does, of course, the average West African or Indian farmer know about the deals that are going down now in Brooklyn, London, and at the World Bank, they can communicate directly with each other. This is very important. There's been a remarkable increase in the availability of previously secret or difficult to acquire knowledge. Everything from live tracking of financial markets, shipping manifests, airplane flights, who are doing all kinds of shipping and tracking here. That's how the trackers found out about the CIA rendition flights, for example. This would have been impossible at another time. Lots of junk and garbage out there, but also a dazzling array, I think, of interesting and wonderful new forms of knowledge that people really have access to. Connected to that is a second feature, and that is a genuinely new internationalism has arisen. The global and cross-national connections that ordinary people now are able to make is unprecedented. This is a word I use very light. I don't usually use that word, but I think it's really quite distinctive. Obviously, like the spread of knowledge, this new internationalism is linked very much to the internet, also to the creation of international civil society organizations, that looming NGO world. The one world claim of global connectedness is false. Divisions, distance, inequality is probably more the norm. But the new internationalism is real at practical and political levels, and I think it's a very important aspect of the possibilities and power of commoning today, especially since one of the classic drawbacks and criticisms of a variety of commons proposals in the past and in the present is that they are only feasible at a local scale, and the world doesn't live at a local scale. Okay, this is classically one of the criticisms. So the new internationalism, I think, offers good, exciting possibilities, experiments for rethinking very, very difficult, sometimes intractable problems of scale. But I think there's interesting things. The third feature, which probably this audience knows a lot about, is the increase in creative and autonomous activities. If you don't have money or power or resources, and it doesn't look like you're ever going to get them, you make stuff yourself, including dissident movements and modes of production. These you make yourself too. This is one of the reasons why political parties are essentially almost irrelevant to radical politics today. And so I'm presuming that a lot of people here probably have a lot of experience in this regard, since the arts have been in DIY mode for a long time now. And so people have a lot of experience. In the old days, we would have called this kind of politically motivated autonomy, particularly if it involved an institutional or an organizational form, like squatted communes or separatist communities, utopian. That's what we might have called it. This word has a very bad reputation. It doesn't deserve it, in my opinion, but it has it. But I think it's fair to say that various political forms of escape or withdrawal from capitalist, social, and economic relations are increasing and are very, very promising. And I think this is where we should situate Kate's project, really. Maybe you don't want it to be situated here, but, and I only know a little bit about it, but it seems to me that one of the things that's interesting and exciting about the Feral Trade Project is that it raises challenging questions about trade and transport, but in ways that have not quite been taken up by the alter globalization movement that in the early 1990s was obviously very focused on the problem of trade, something called erroneously free trade. And free markets, and in fact fair trade was to some extent an attempt to offer an alternative to that kind of intensive marketization of other parts of the world. And I think you might not agree, Kate, I don't know, that it still remains important despite its limitations for at least standing for that. And we could talk more about the specifics of the regulatory process of certification and control and so on and so forth if people are interested in that, or Kate and I could talk about that on our own. But one of the things that your project did make me think about was trade and supply routes and how important these are to us, how little we know about them, how much we take them for granted, and how in many ways invisible they are. And you know, these sort of pathways and stopping places that are used for all kinds of things, not just the commercial transport of cargo. You know, these networks, administrative routes, military routes, passenger routes, some of which Kate taps into, postal routes, signal routes, tribute and banking routes, nomadic routes, migrant routes, open and clandestine, pilgrimage routes, pirate raiding routes. These interest me. All kinds of political escape routes, including ones that in the US context would be very familiar to us, such as the Underground Railroad, for example, which wasn't an actual railroad, but was in fact a smuggling route that moved runaway slaves to free northern states and into Canada in the 19th century. It was resurrected in the 1980s by the Solidarity movement that was trying to move political refugees from Central America to safe houses in North America. And so the north-south Underground Railroad routes were moved west so that they could move up through Texas and the western states, but with a very similar kind of exchange route of people. So to the extent that we might want to situate the feral trade project in its cafe and an alternative genealogy of radical trading routes and radical traders, maybe in the end we would look less to the diggers and their sort of barter gift economy and more to the long history of piracy, the equally long radical history of radical sailors and longshoremen, even maybe to, because I said I would mention them, so I think I should, the Newcastle keelmen, the highly skilled boatmen who moved the coal from the riverside to the ships on the River Tyne. The keelmen were, as we say in France, renowned for their militancy, militants as we would call them, for their independence and also for fighting the Navy, who seemed to be always trying to capture and impress them into service, another kind of enclosure. So all these radical traders were certainly commoners, both in the sense of being both ordinary working men and women, and commoners in the sense that they all opposed the terms of enclosure that they confronted. Pirates, keelmen, radical sailors, and so on. And so in that sense, they were trying to create a reality that was not enclosed by values and modes of being together that are based on money and exchange value, or based on hierarchies of status and worth. The pirates were famous for very interesting horizontal independent communities on ship and outside of it, modes of being together based on violence, force, alienation, discipline. Whatever their degree of success or failure, I think all these radical traders try to live otherwise, in that sense, to run away in place or towards some other places they could make according to their own rules. One of the perennial questions that radical thinkers and activists debate endlessly and often angrily is whether it's ever possible to escape or get outside the system. People feel very strongly about this, in my view, and it tends to sort of define their political identity. So utopian is the epithet that there is no outside people throw at the people who say we are not merely the subjects of the capitalist world system people. They kind of throw these names at each other. I don't think this is something that we're going to decide here. I'm going to start talking right now. But I thought if I could take one more minute, is that okay? That I would read you a short passage from a great novel that actually raises these questions, I think, in really interesting ways. I encourage you to read the novel and see what the possibilities of going feral might include, and to see what past and future traditions might be invoked. Anybody know this book, Iron Council, by China Miéville?
Yeah.
Yes, one person. Okay, you read this book. That's good. Okay, I'm going to read just a word from this. It's called Iron Council. It's the third in China Miéville's trilogy, science kind of fantasy series about a city-state called New Krobazone. The novel is about the building of a railroad across a desert wilderness, which the city-state initiates in large measure as part of an expansionist war that they're waging. So at the center of this novel is the train, of course, the great symbol of the 19th century Industrial Revolution, our great transport line. And it's three individuals: Judah, a sort of gifted scout for the railroad; Hari, who is a prostitute working along the railway lines in the railway towns; and Usman, who is a slave known in the books as a remade. Each of these three individuals, for good reasons, work together to lead a revolution in which the railroad workers get rid of their bosses, free the remade, who are slaves, and hijack the train. And they face a fundamental question of what to do with the train when the railroad police are at their heels. There's argument and debate between Anhari and Usman. Usman wants to stay and fight. Anhari wants them to go far beyond the borders that they know. So this is from the book. Usman tells them that whichever way they see it, whatever they claim to themselves, Anhari is telling them to run. That's not the answer. Ain't running, Anhari says. We're done here, we're something new. It's running, he says, utopian. It's something new, we're something new, she says, and Usman shakes his head. This is running, he says. She points into the darkness of the tunnel. We unrolled history, we made history. Now we've plowed that up, we'll go on and take our history with us. Remake, it's all our wealth, it's everything, it's all we have, we'll take it. The strikers of the Iron Council do join her, and this is what Mielville writes. Their wealth and history is embedded in the train. They are a town moving. It is their moment in iron and grease. They control it, Iron Council. The motion of the council begins. It is the same motion that has brought them so far. It is exactly the same motion, and it is utterly new. The urgency is drunken, the pace faster. As the rails come clear, ground clean by the weight of the train, the men and women take them up again. Miles of track reused. Reused, it is the train's future and its present, and it emerges a fraction more scarred as history and is hauled up again and becomes another future. The train carries its track with it, picking it up and laying it down, a sliver, a moment of railroad. No longer a line split through time, but contingent and fleeting, recurring beneath the train, leaving only its footprint. The perpetual train deviates west-northeast into wilderness where there is nothing, a new unmapped place. The train is going feral. The perpetual train has gone wild. The Iron Council is renegade. And you have to read the novel yourself to find out, he knows, what actually happens to the Iron Council and what it might mean for us today. Yeah, I think I'll end there. Thanks.